Hi, I'm glad to see you again. In the first lecture, we didn't pay much attention to the diversity of human needs. Today, we need to consider it because the topic of today's lecture is the allocation of resources, and more specifically, the objective that we are trying to achieve through that allocation. Of course, we are not going to go through a complete catalog of needs. It'll be enough to recognize that there are many of them and that they can be divided into certain categories according to their nature and the general way in which they can be satisfied. The most popular classification of human needs is that of Abraham Maslow, but we are not going to discuss it today. Perhaps I will come back to it in one of the side note videos. Instead, I would like to propose a simple matrix. In terms of their nature, we can divide our needs into physiological, originating in our bodies, and psychological, originating in our minds. In terms of how they are satisfied, we can divide them into material, those that require consumption, and non material, those that do not. It is important that we do not confuse these two dimensions. That is, that we do not assume that satisfying physiological needs always requires consumption and satisfying psychological needs never does, because it's simply not true. Some physiological needs can actually be satisfied without using any goods at all. For obvious reasons, however, we won't go into the details. What's more interesting, satisfying psychological needs may actually require far more goods than you might expect. To see this, just look at a theater or a concert hall, not only at the building itself, but also at everything inside it. But we don't go to these places simply to experience art. We go there also to meet other people. In fact, the vast majority of our psychological needs are social needs. Although social needs are not satisfied through consumption, but through interactions with other people, these interactions do not take place in a vacuum. Most often, they take place alongside shared consumption of goods, like, for example, a dinner with friends or traveling together, or alongside consumption that takes place in the presence of other people. When consuming our goods publicly, we also demonstrate our socioeconomic status. We do not necessarily try to show that it is higher than that of those around us, but certainly that it is no lower. Even if we are not fully aware of that fact, we understand it intuitively. If we would not, we would hardly care about the style of our clothes, and yet we do. So, in reality, majority of consumer goods serve satisfying both our physiological and psychological needs at the same time. The catalog of needs is essentially the same for every human being. However, different people may experience different needs with different intensity. That's why one person may care more about food, another about their appearance, and yet another about leisure or social interactions. However, satisfying any one of our needs is equally important to us. After all, the sheer fact that we experience a particular need means that it has to be satisfied. At first, this conclusion may seem to contradict our experience. Surely, satisfying our need for food must be more important as, say, satisfying our need for literature. Without food, we would die quickly. Without literature, probably not. But this only tells us that satisfying our need for food is, as a rule, more urgent than satisfying our need for literature, not more important. Person deprived for long enough of the ability to satisfy their psychological needs, whatever those needs might be, would eventually suffer serious psychological harm and lose the ability to function normally. So, satisfying needs that are born in our mind is for our well being as important as satisfying those that are born in our body. Once we properly understand the difference between urgency and importance, we can finally move on to the main subject of our lecture. The existence of any complex physical system, including a human being, has many different dimensions, which we can consider at different levels of detail. In the case of a living organism, we can understand these dimensions as its needs. In the case of an inanimate system, we can understand them as its subsystems. The second way of looking at these dimensions is actually more general, because what we experience as a particular need is a reflection of the state of one of the subsystems that make up our organism. Therefore, from this point on, we will use these terms interchangeably, as well as the terms overall state and satisfaction, the latter being a reflection of the former. Now, the state of each subsystem can be described by a number between 0 and 1, where 1 represents an ideal state and 0 represents complete dysfunction. The system as a whole will be in an ideal state only if all of its subsystems will be in an ideal state. But it takes only one of the subsystems to become dysfunctional for the entire system to become dysfunctional as well. Therefore, the overall state of a system can be described as a product of the states of its individual subsystems, or in other words, of its partial states. However, any functioning system will always be in a state which is somewhere between the nothingness of 0 and the completeness of 1. And that creates a technical problem. Because if we would express its overall state as the product of its partial states, the result would depend on not only the partial states, but also on how many of them we distinguished. There is, however, a simple solution to this problem, because instead of using the product, we can use the geometric mean of its partial states. Now that we have a model linking partial states of a system with its overall state, we can finally turn to the question of allocation. Let's start with the simplest possible example. Suppose we have only two needs, and satisfying each of them fully requires 15 hours a day. So, in our example, the resource we have to allocate is our own time, the only resource provided to us directly by nature. But there is only 24 hours in a day, not 30. So, fully satisfying both our needs is impossible. We have an allocation problem. One common way of presenting solution to such a problem is to do it geometrically. So, let's go to the presentation. The two axes represent the amount of time we can spend on satisfying need A or need B. On satisfying each of them, we may spend up to 24 hours, but the more time we spend on one, the less we can spend on the other. This relationship is represented by the diagonal line, which we call budget constraint. So in this case, this line simply represents 24 hours a day. Of course, no one is going to allocate more time to a need than is required to satisfy it fully, which is in our case 15 hours. So I've marked these nonsensical allocation areas in gray. Now let's take a look at one possible allocation. The satisfaction we achieve from any given allocation is represented by the area of the rectangle formed by connecting the corresponding point on our budget constraint to the two axes. Here we have another allocation which gives us slightly greater area of the rectangle. But of course this area will be greatest when the rectangle becomes a square. So, in our example, we achieve maximum satisfaction when we satisfy both needs to the same degree. It can be expressed as zero point 0.8, which, by the way, is the same as our overall ability to satisfy our needs. We can also present the same principle in another way, which shows the optimum more clearly. On this graph, our satisfaction is represented by the vertical axis, while the horizontal axis represents different allocation ratios. Now, our budget constraint is represented by a curved line, which takes the shape of a semicircle. This line represents at the same time different levels of satisfaction, or if you like, different areas of the rectangle corresponding to different allocations of our time. As we move away from the optimum in any of the directions, our satisfaction declines. However, it initially declines very slowly, much less than proportionally. So, within a certain relatively broad range, deviations from optimum have almost no effect on our satisfaction. That's why we don't react to small deviations. We simply cannot feel the effects. And the existence of this area of indifference is crucial to our efficiency. Because if we had to respond to every, even the smallest deviation from the optimum, we would spend almost all our time changing the objective of our actions, and there would be hardly any time left for the actions themselves. It is also worth to take a look at how our satisfaction increases as we continue to satisfy a given need that is initially as unsatisfied as it can possibly be. We can see that at first the improvement in our overall state is very large. However, as the degree to which that need is satisfied increases, each further improvement becomes smaller. This phenomenon, known as the principle of diminishing marginal utility, follows directly from the fact that we have many different needs. If we had only one need, our state would improve proportionally to the satisfaction of that need. So far, we have considered the simplest possible case. But now we are going to drop one of our simplifying assumptions. Suppose situation changes. Satisfying one of our needs now requires 20 hours a day, while satisfying the other requires only 10. Our overall ability to satisfy our needs has not changed. We still have 24 hours available compared with 30 hours required. So, just as before, it can be expressed as zero point 0.8. However, the difference in how difficult the two needs are to satisfy gives us additional opportunity to increase our satisfaction above this level. Because if we fully satisfy the need that is easier to satisfy and allocate only the rest of our time to the other one, we would achieve a satisfaction of about 0.84. But in reality, we never take advantage of such an opportunity. Because regardless of how difficult or how easy to satisfy any particular need might be, we always satisfy whichever of our needs is the least satisfied at any given moment. So, on average, over a longer period of time, we end up satisfying all our needs to more or less the same degree. But that means that, contrary to what economists tell us, we are not maximizing our satisfaction. The actual objective of our actions is to minimize the risk that insufficient satisfaction of any of our needs will seriously impair our ability to act, thereby becoming a threat to our survival. Our objective, then, is no different from objectives pursued by other living organisms. It would be actually very strange if it were. Just as strange, perhaps, as the fact that economists persist in claiming that our objective is maximizing satisfaction, even though the allocation principle we have just discussed has been well known in the natural sciences for quite some time. The fact that when choosing to satisfy a given need, we do not take into account how difficult to satisfy it is, doesn't mean that we ignore the relationship between effects and outlays. It simply means that this relationship matters only when we choose how to satisfy our needs. Among the different ways available to us, we will choose the one that gives us the highest ratio, thereby maximizing our overall ability to satisfy our needs. Under given conditions, this leads to the development of relatively stable ways of satisfying our needs. We can call them habits or preferences. Whether or not the way in which we can satisfy our need is consistent with our preferences may have some impact on our satisfaction, but this impact will be relatively small. By contrast, whether or not we are able to satisfy any given need has always a profound impact on our overall state. The distinction between needs and preferences is therefore essential if we want to properly understand the factors that determine our actions. And yet, for some time now, economists seem to have avoided talking about needs altogether. Instead, they prefer to see all allocation decisions as being driven by preferences. But surely only someone who has never experienced hunger could fail to see the absurdity of calling a need for food a preference for food. Perhaps then we should define an economist simply as a well fed person trying to explain reality to those who are not quite as well fed. And with this question, I'll leave you until our next lecture. If you learned something new from this video, I'd appreciate if you gave it a like and shared it with others. And if you are curious to see where this journey takes us next, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. As always, I'm looking forward to your comments. That's all for today. I'll see you soon. Take care.